So just a little bit of background about me, which is a bit relevant to this presentation, is that I am a medical doctor and I specialize in public health and health promotion, and I teach health communication skills at 2 universities. I'm currently doing research in looking at science communication through the lens of cultural anthropology, and that's the topic of my PhD. The reason I did this is because I actually took a little bit of time off medicine to read some science, and I was quite taken back by the obligatory first chapter of every popular book I read. And I'm talking about popular books here, you know, Brian Greene, Neil deGrasse Tyson, those kind of books. The obligatory, your religion is false and your life has no meaning, before we get into talking about science. I just wanted to learn about the science. I wasn't really interested in being told that I had no free will and that my life had no meaning. And so, and just a quick note before we start is that using the terms communication and popularization, I do use the term communication a lot. I probably do mean popularization more than I mean communication. And I believe that it is important to popularize science if we want large amounts of people to believe in it and be mobilized and follow some of the things that we're trying to achieve. So I start off with this quote, that you're all going to die, and so will everyone you love. Then there will be heat death, all the change in the universe will cease, all the stars will die, and there'll be nothing left of anything but infinite, dead, freezing void. Human life, in all its noise and hubris, will be rendered meaningless for eternity. Now, that particular statement is deliberately provoking. It's the beginning of William Storr's Science of Storytelling, and it tries to explain why human beings use stories for terror management, so that we can get through our lives without thinking about all the terrible things that could happen to us. So we create stories and we live our lives that way. And some of the quotes that I've been reading recently, David Bennett, I better never to have been. If you haven't read that, I think that's probably a good thing for most people. I presented that at my PhD meeting, and after that, everyone asked me if I was okay. But one of the quotes is, "A charmed life is so rare. For every one such life, there are millions of wretched lives." So his argument is that it's antinatalism, that we shouldn't actually bring people into this world because doing so causes them to suffer. Yuval Noah Harari, one of the most popular books in the world. As far as we can tell from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. We're an outcome of blind evolutionary processes that operate without goal or purpose. I love this article in The New Scientist. Your dog may not like you as much as you think it does. It's an article written by a science communicator who tries to convince you that your dog doesn't love you at all. And a few comments that I read specifically said, "Do you really think this is true? I love my dog." Yes, thank you, Patrick. Yeah, and people were somewhat taken back by that. And of course, the lovely Brian Greene, "You're a bag of particles acting out the laws of physics." So I have these quotes, and before moving on to a discussion, I just want to compare it with some other quotes. Oops. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. That must be the next one. I'm interested to know how these quotes make you feel. A few people in my science department say, "Yeah, so who cares? I accept life has no meaning, and I'm okay with that." But I think a lot of people outside the realm of science, whether they are religious or spiritual, or whether they believe their life has some inherent meaning, possibly turned away somewhat from reading popular science literature. Does anybody have any particular thing they want to say about that? Write in the comments, or tell me if that makes them feel a little bit upset, or if it doesn't bother them at all. I'm quite interested to know if that bothers people who are actually in the field of science. If you feel like saying something, please do. If you feel like typing something in, that'd be great too. Yeah, and I get that a lot. I mean, the most people in science say it doesn't really bother me because they're brought up that way or they're used to it, and they never thought about that any other way. But the vast majority of the world's population are still deeply religious. Yes, it is changing, but a lot of people, when they hear those quotes, may be turned away from science, and in doing so, that creates a few more problems, which we will get to. And so some of the other quotes is, Bill Nye says science is the key to our future. If you don't believe in it, you're holding everybody back. And he's very much into climate change, and he very passionately tells us that we need to change our ways to prevent climate change and that it's not too late. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, talking about climate change, says that what will it take for people to recognize that a community of scientists are learning objective truths about the natural world and that you can benefit from knowing about it. And Brian Greene says most people don't question the practice of eating meat. Many of these people care about the animals and the environment, and some deeply, but for reasons such as force of habit or cultural resistance to change, there's a fundamental disconnect where these feelings don't translate into changes of behavior. And I really think that our quote is important, because Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens* was also very passionate about telling us to treat animals better after he told us that our life has no meaning. And Brian Greene is very much against the concept of free will, doesn't believe in free will, and yet wonders why people don't change, have resistance to change. So is this a paradox? We live in a deterministic world without free will, yet we must choose to accept science and prevent climate change, and we must act now. Is that a paradox? Is that something that's difficult for science communicators and popularizers to deal with? Does anybody find that to be a paradox? Is this a paradox? The universe is destined to end in a dead, freezing void and life has no meaning, but we must prevent climate change so our planet does not become a dead, freezing void, and so we can continue our meaningless lives. Is that a paradox? Is that going to make it hard for science communicators to get their point across? So it's possible that those who are not aligning with science will not accept the scientific argument regarding climate change, because doing so forces one to accept that their life has no meaning, that their religion is false, that their spirituality is an illusion, and that their relationship with their dog is based on an evolutionary lie. Now, you may not feel this, but people in our community may feel this way. And as an example, I have a little hobby, which is a really unusual hobby. I read CNN and then I read Fox News, and I compare the comments and I compare the stories. And I love reading the comments in Fox News. If you really wanted to read from people who think differently from scientists, then Fox News isn't a bad place to start. And I do read a lot of the comments. And Fox News is a must-watch for evangelicals and a turn-off for atheists. And I've just posted some of the comments in Fox News regarding climate change. And basically, I know some of them are long, but the vast majority who make comments, or almost everybody who makes comments on Fox News, which is the biggest news outlet in the United States, very much do not believe in climate change at all. Wonderful quote from Francis Collins, who's the leader of the International Human Genome Project. He wrote a book called Language of God. And he said the evidence of potential harmony between science and religion is often overshadowed by the high decibel pronouncements of those who occupy the opposite poles of the debate. So sometimes I feel that science and popularizing it and communicating it is often reacting to the opposite pole, who are very much against science and very much use arguments of religion to against science. And sometimes I think it's that opposite pole that sometimes drives science communicators. I've just finished reading Robert Sapolsky's Determined, a new book that came out just in October. And I can't help but feel that he's a lot more condescending than he used to be. And I also can't help but feel that people on the opposite poles of the debate, who are the ones that are probably taking the time to write to him and make comments on his work, are potentially influencing this attitude becoming more condescending over time. So for me, I think science communication is a technology. It is false to say that science created the world's problems because science invented the atomic bomb. Science did no such thing. The science behind it may have been discovered, but it was the technologies and the political decisions to drop the bomb. But if science communication is a technology, should we use that technology a bit more wisely? I'm not suggesting that we should change the origin story because it upsets people. I'm not saying we should change the way we communicate in scientific journals. I am just wondering if we should change the way we communicate with the public. If science communication has certain aims and objectives, shouldn't we be trying to meet those aims and objectives? And if those aims and objectives are to try and change people's behavior, then perhaps we should change the way we communicate science rather than tell people that their lives have no meaning and that they have no free will. Being a health promotion expert myself, medicine being one of the sciences behind healthcare, it is a science, yet we take a very person-centered approach to discussing healthcare and promoting healthcare. For example, at the Royal North Shore Hospital, which I was there recently, the birthing unit, the word welcome is written over 30 languages. Patients are asked for their religious beliefs so that a spiritual guide may be provided at the time of death. Compare this to Stephen Hawking, who states, heaven and the afterlife is a fairy story for people who are afraid of the dark. If you never believed in religion, that statement may not upset you or offend you, but something else I should have included in my background. I come from a Sicilian family, so my family and my extended family are all very much Roman Catholic, and I would never talk to them in this way. Their religion and their spiritual beliefs are very important to them. I don't sit around having arguments with them about evolution, etc. That gives their life meaning, that brings them peace, and that makes them happy, therefore it makes me happy. So in healthcare, we do have a very person-centered approach. It's a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. So if religion contributes to that social well-being, then we encourage it and embrace that. So some questions are, if we had some evidence to suggest that science communication or popularization the way in which we did it resulted in a decrease in mental health and social well-being, would we change our approach? If we had some evidence that changing our approach to science communication could result in more action towards climate change, could we change our approach? And again, in my disclaimer, I'm not saying we should change science at all. And I'm not saying that we should say that life has meaning if we don't believe it does. I'm just suggesting we could potentially leave that part out of our science communication because we feel there is no real benefit to reminding people of that. And there are some scientific experiments that suggest that when you tell people they don't have free will, it tends to cause people to cheat more, become more aggressive, and show less willingness to help others. The evidence isn't particularly strong, but there have been some experiments which have shown that. So some final thoughts, and this is a quote from Harari, which says, from a biological perspective, nothing is unnatural. Whatever is possible by definition is natural. So our belief in stories is biological. Our belief in a God and a spirituality and meaning in life is biological. Believing in free will is biological, therefore natural. Sapolsky states that getting rid of free will completely strikes at our sense of identity and autonomy and where we get meaning from. He also stated that he himself has trouble living as though he has no free will. He says he finds that very difficult. And I think that really says something. Another quote from Sapolsky, when asked, do we lose love too if we lose free will? He says, yeah, like, wow, why? Why did this person turn out to love me? Where did that come from? So I find that a very interesting approach, an approach I'd like to take personally, but my research isn't to prove that we should behave like this, that science communication should change. It's asking the question whether or not it should. And I may, at the end of my next couple of years, be talked out of this, but at the moment, I'm just happily researching along to try and work out what kind of effect our sort of pessimism that's creeping into science communication and popularization, what kind of effect that is having. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was amazing, incredibly thought-provoking talk about your research. Thank you for presenting so many ideas there that I will have to ponder. Please submit any questions that you have in the chat, and feel free also to use the what are they called? Emotion reaction to clap and celebrate Chris's fantastic presentation just now. To get us started, I have a question. How could science communication be approached by taking anthropology into account, Chris?
It is a difficult sort of question because we're not changing the science. I mean, I'm not asking anybody to change the science. If the Big Bang people the Big Bang theory upsets some religious adherents, then, we shouldn't actually change that. What I'm suggesting is that we sometimes leave out the things such as your life has no meaning. Why does that really have to be discussed? I mean, there may be certain scientific journals where that's important to discuss, but in terms of a book which is trying to encourage people to work against climate change, to actually have in that your life has no meaning is quite unusual and I think counterintuitive. So I would suggest that, and the fact of the matter is meaning is a personal thing. It's maybe not something that science should be tackling anyway. I mean, I know I derive meaning from my life. That may not have a scientific basis, but meaning is what's important to me and my family, and to live a life where I say to my children, well, nothing you do is wrong and nothing you do should be rewarded, is just not practical in a biological sense, as far as I can see. So it's not about necessarily changing, but it's about thinking about what we can leave out, or accepting that people can find meaning in a way that is not necessarily scientific.
That's really interesting, Chris. And yes, I was thinking that in your talk, like, well, there's a place for science to explain a lot of things, but there's also a place for philosophy and religion in other areas of our lives, and history, perhaps.
I think it was Stephen Hawking who said philosophy is dead, but I'm not sure, as smart as that man was, I'm not sure I agree with him.
Very interesting. We have another question from Kate Patterson, who asks, could you talk a little bit about your approach to finding examples of pessimistic language related to science?
Thank you, Kate. I actually find this in popular science books. So in my PhD progress meeting yesterday, I was asked why I'm not reading more scientific literature and why I'm going to popular science, but that's exactly what I'm analyzing. I'm analyzing the popular science. So I will read Stephen Hawking, I will read Neil deGrasse Tyson, Brian Greene, Yuval Noah Harari, etc., etc. I mean, Richard Dawkins should be added to that. And I read them because they interest me, but also because I'm very interested in the language that we are using to talk to people, to get them interested in science. And this is what these popularizers normally try and do. They try and get people interested in science. And I find it a little bit ironic that they derive so much meaning in their lives by trying to convince others that their lives have no meaning, or at least not from a purely scientific standpoint anyway. So yeah, that's where I get them from. I'm just reading the most popular literature that's on the shelf at Kinokuniya, basically.
And I have a question. Are you envisaging that some of the research you will uncover or do in your PhD would have some tips for professional science communicators on their approach to communicating science and research?
On one hand, yes, I would, and on another hand, I'm hoping that I would fight for people who have rejected science, that have disengaged from science, and maybe influence other science communicators to fight for people who have disengaged from science for these reasons. So I would like to hear a few more voices that really embrace humans and their culture and their beliefs, not in a destructive way, but in ways that bring them happiness and them peace. I think a lot of religious people are not the religious people you hear about all the time because they're operating on one pole of the debate. I think there are a lot of people who just derive meaning from a spiritual existence, and that convinces them to be a good, happy, loving person. And I think that should be encouraged as being very good for society. So I would say that I would like to, at the end of this, maybe have some hints and tips, as you suggested. Not that I'd thought of that, but I think it is a very good suggestion, that maybe there's some of the things we should avoid doing when we try and communicate and popularize science if we want to make a real impact in the world.
Well, I would definitely appreciate them. So you have one person who's going to be a reader to start with. We're getting a few more questions in now.
Yep.
Thank you, everyone. You're warming up. So Anne Harrod asks, I think one of the strengths we have as science communicators is our ability to empathize and build rapport. In order to communicate effectively, we have to understand our audience. It seems to me that by making confrontational comments that may upset people, that does undermine our work. I think you're make an interesting point there, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And Jack O'Connor asks, what are you seeing as the output of showing your research beyond your thesis, the book, a popular science book, perhaps?
Again, I'd like to be, in my opportunities to communicate science, I'd like to be a defender of people and their cultures and their ideals and their morals and their values, their ethics and their spiritual beliefs. I would like to be able to defend that and say that science is not necessarily incompatible with that. It's not for me to say what goes on inside your mind and how you feel about things and the introspective nature of yourself. It's just for me to communicate what we can observe and what we can test. So I would like, if I did write a book, which my thesis may turn into, I would like very much to have a book that communicates science, but also defends people for being who they are and what we're capable of being through a search for meaning.
Excellent answer. And we have a question from Debbie Boldy. From your experience of health communication, is there something that science communicators can take on board from how we teach doctors to communicate with patients?
Absolutely. Doctors used to be just as bad as some science communicators or some science popularizers. We used to think that everything was in the medicine. And if the medicine gave you certain data, it wasn't for the patient to argue that. The patient was basically a set of results. We realized that patients actually were healthier if we cared about them as a human being, if we communicated with them better, even if the treatment was exactly the same, if we understood who they were and why they felt sick. Because disease isn't always caused by a virus or a specific illness. Sometimes it's caused by emotional states or how the person feels. And we all know about the placebo effect, and that's something we wouldn't have predicted before we found out that it existed, that people believing that they will get better actually contributes to them getting better. If people really believe that they can make a difference, is what I'm suggesting, then they're more likely to go out there and try and make a difference. If they don't believe that they can, then they're less likely to be motivated. So that's what I would like to bring from my health communication experience, is put the person at the center of their decisions to do the right thing to change the world. And don't take them away from that. Don't say, well, you're not at the center of your decisions. You have to listen to us because we are the experts. And that's what medicine used to do for a very long time. And it changed mostly.
I like this. I think, yes, human-centered science communication might be a new thing. I think it's really important. We have a comment from Patrick asking about your reading list seems to be quite physics heavy. Are you also looking at books from different disciplines like biologists and conservationists?
That's a very good point. It's the physicists who have tended to really want to go into the realm of origin stories, creation through cosmology, and use that as evidence that there is no meaning in our life. However, Robert Sapolsky is someone who I quoted quite a lot, and he's an evolutionary biologist or primatologist. So he is someone, but definitely that's a very good idea to expand more into biologists. I've still got 2.5 years to go, so I've got a lot more reading to do, but definitely biology and evolution are going to be a huge part of this. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, great. Maybe you can pop some suggestions in the chat for Chris, anyone who's got a great science book that you think Chris should be reading. Jake Willett asks, do you think the issue of scientists and their disdain for the sentimental side of their research stems from their education? E.g., for example, being told something is true and is the way of the universe. Should there be some mandatory component that looks at the philosophy of science in its teaching?
Well, I would love if there would be. I think it's very difficult to convince a scientist that anything they do should be mandatory, especially in the area of philosophy. But I would absolutely love to see more of that in university teaching, that we do get a broader view. I think a lot of people who I've spoken to, and people in my department, were just never brought up religious. They were never brought up with a spirituality. And I found it hard to understand how they could feel absolutely nothing. And I asked one once, I said, I'm not Buddhist, but if I walk into a Buddhist temple and I hear some chanting and I smell some incense, that has some sort of effect on me. And the person I asked that question said, me, absolutely not. I wouldn't even walk in. So there is definitely people are brought up differently, are educated differently. I had a Catholic education, and I think that was quite more common when I was going through school. Now most people have a secular education, which is great. And I think more and more people are becoming atheists as well, according to the census. And I think it may be changing the way we communicate science. But most of the world, religion is still growing. So we do have to take that into account, that people who are religious are still going to be responsible for changing the world. And so I do feel that you're right, it does stem from their education. And I would, personally like to see some broader topics being introduced into science, but whether or not it will be is another thing.
Fantastic answer. Thank you, Chris. And thank you, everyone, for your excellent question. So in a minute, we are going to hear from Jake Willett. So thank you very much, Chris. Everyone, round of applause for Chris and his amazing presentation. Please send an emoji or something like you do. Clap like this. Wonderful. That was really fascinating, Chris. And I think I would like to see your reading list as well. It looks like it's covering a lot of the big topics in life and science. So all the best with your PhD.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.